Hey guys. This is part 6 of What If Naruto and Sasuke became friends a few years early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 17. Zaku was exhausted, which he felt was fair, given that he hadn't slept at all. The proctor who'd shown them to their rooms the previous night had come to retrieve them early in the morning, smiling at them and wishing them good luck the whole time. He'd grumbled his way to the arena beside his teammate, Dosu, who looked far better rested than he was. "I did tell you to sleep," the boy had said, looking more than a little annoyed. "Yeah, it wasn't exactly on purpose, jackass." He was on edge from more than just a lack of sleep. Today was the day their fates were sealed. Either they proved themselves in Orochimaru's scheme, or they were cast aside, and more than likely killed. He swallowed on nothing as their guide pushed open a door just in front of them, leading them into a massive central room, where a gargantuan carving of the Leaf's unison sign hung upon the back wall. Zaku realized that they were one of the first groups to arrive as he looked around, seeing only one other group present. He ground his teeth together as he realized who it was. Team 7, their targets, and the ones who'd nearly killed Kin. They noticed them as well, it seemed, as Sasuke Uchiha took a subtle stance, not directly threatening, but more of a deterrent. He didn't take his eyes off of them as he spoke to his teammates, gesturing their way as they looked over towards them. Upon seeing Zaku, the other two members of that accursed team stiffened. The pink-haired girl, who'd been the one to stab Kin in the chest and shoulder, paled. She stood silently for just a moment, before actually taking a step towards them. "What is she doing?" Two hands stopped the girl in her tracks, each belonging to one of her teammates. They exchanged heated words, to which the girl could respond only with a small declaration, and she turned back towards them with fire in her eyes. A second later they let her go, gazing over towards Zaku and his teammate with a silent promise. "Try anything, and you answer to us." "Yeah, trust me," Zaku thought, growling under his breath. "I get it." After the girl had walked a few paces towards them, she faltered, standing just a step or two away from him and Dosu. "The hell do you want?" He could feel some anger seeping into his words, anger that he hadn't meant to make known. Pink Hair looked up at them, opened her mouth, blanked on what she wanted to say, and closed it. What happened to your arm?" He'd actually nearly forgotten about what Orochimaru had done to it, what with the immense stress they'd been faced with. Staring down at the makeshift splint he'd spent some time in the forest making, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of annoyance. "This girl. It's all her fault. I broke it, fell off a tree." He lied easily, looking at her nonchalantly. "You got something to say, or what?" The girl took a deep breath, and seemed to resign herself. Where's your third member?" She spoke quietly, nearly whispering. Something in the girl's expression made him shake with rage, and he had to physically calm himself down, taking a deep breath before he answered her question. "She's in the medical bay, recovering from when you stabbed her," he practically spat out. He hadn't expected the girl to deflate at his words, falling to her knees in front of him in abject relief. "That's..." The girl sighed deeply, a smile adorning her face. "That's fantastic." "What?" "I was worried I thought she might have succumbed to her wounds." The girl shook her head, likely trying to dispel such thoughts. "I'm just glad to hear everything was all right." His teeth ground together. "All right." Zaku seethed silently. "She thinks everything just turned out hunky-dory." "Well, if that's all, then kindly go foo." "That's not it." The girl interrupted him, looking up at him with steel in her gaze. "I also wanted to thank you personally." Staring down at someone he'd been ordered to kill as they thanked them on hands and knees, he couldn't help but wonder how he was supposed to react. "What am I supposed to say to this shit? We tried to kill you, and you're coming over here to say fucking thank you." The girl blushed, for God's sake, and looked down, seemingly unsure of how to word her thoughts. "Whatever it is that Orochimaru put on me, It was affecting me. She rubbed the back of her neck absent-mindedly. I wasn't myself, and I almost killed that girl. The kunoichi below him finally looked him in the eye, but her gaze was softer than he thought it'd be, filled with honest gratitude. Thank you for stopping me. Even if you were just doing it to save your teammate, thank you. The girl looked away again, seemingly having said her piece before. With an almost embarrassed smile, she once again looked towards him. Oh, and I don't think you guys are all that bad of people, so I think you should probably stop working for that Orochimaru guy. He's bad news. White-hot anger shot through his veins as he stared down at the girl before him, and he scowled fiercely as he grabbed her by the shirt and hauled her off of the ground, shoving her back towards her team. Go, he commanded sharply. What? Go back to your team, and stay the hell away from me, no, from us. He pushed the girl lightly, making her stagger back a pace or two. Why are you acting like that? Don't ask me that bullshit. He'd screamed it so loud that the proctors who stood on the walkways above them peered over, looking ready to intervene if this turned into a fight, but Sasuke didn't care. There was too much anger coursing through him, too many things that raged within him, for him to ignore now. Why am I acting like this? Sasuke howled, incensed with rage at the girl's question. You want to know? You come over here like a spoiled child, so comfortable in your own little world, and you say that you're oh so happy that you get to keep your eyes closed. The girl took a step back, her eyes wide. If that were all, then fine, you're just some spoiled little brat. I've met a million of those. Sasuke's knuckles were white as he balled his fists at his side. You're someone who's never seen the real world, and that's fine. Honestly, I'm jealous. What? You were born in this village, grew up in this village, and if I were to guess, I'd say you'll die in this village, too. Never once seeing the world, realizing just how bad it can be, just how unfortunate some of the rest of us are. What are you talking about? A firm hand grabbed his shoulder, trying to pull him back. He knew without looking that it was Dosu, but he didn't much care. He had to teach this ignorant brat what the world was really like. I doubt you'll ever have to scrounge for food in the garbage, or steal from shops and stalls on the streets, or pick the pockets of other people who are just as unfortunate as you are, all just to survive. Sasuke could tell his words were having an effect on the girl, for she drew further back with every word. Good. Behind her, the girl's teammates were stepping up to face him, but as he kept speaking, they halted. But all of that's fine, I don't expect everyone to have to go through the same shit I did. I'm not some idiot who thinks everyone in the world's gonna get dealt a bad hand. If that were it, I honestly would have accepted all this, just gone on and ignored you. His eyes locked onto hers, his face showing only fury. But then you have the fucking audacity to tell me to stop working for him. The girl looked indignantly at him, her lips drawn down in a small frown as she tried to retaliate. And what's so wrong with that? Do you honestly like working for that guy? Of course I don't. She took a step back, a quiet terror playing upon her face, like she was trying in vain to run away from his words. The look suited her. Do you honestly think anyone would want to work for someone like him? He roared, throwing his arms out in wild gestures. You think it's just the bad guys who end up on his side, don't you? He laughed as the girl tensed, realizing that was exactly what she'd thought. Everything's so black and white to you, isn't it? Good. You should let it stay that way. Life's way easier if you can honestly believe that everyone you'll have to face down on the battlefield is evil. Dosa pulled on him hard, trying once more to prevent him from shouting out, but Sasuke broke away, leaning into his words like they were blows. Don't take the time to realize that they've got people, too. Don't even think about how maybe, just maybe, they want to be there about as much as you do. Or maybe, they're attacking because the food where they come from is scarce, and they don't have enough land to grow more. Or because they just want to protect the people they care about. Or maybe, just maybe, they never had a damn choice in the matter from the beginning. He looked upon the girl before him, silently relishing in her mortification as he dug into her. Some of us got picked up off of the street, told that our only chance to live was to become weapons, to jump when told to jump, to kill when we were told to kill, who we were told to kill, No questions asked? So no, girl. He found himself finally out of breath, his tirade finished. I won't be leaving Orochimaru's service, and if I do? He leaned directly into her face, barely 6 inches separating them. It'll be because I'm dead. The girl before him stared up at him in fear for just a moment longer, before her face contorted once more. Pity. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Looking down on me. A flash of red, and a feeling of hands all over him, preventing him from going any further. His fist had been stopped only an inch from the girl's face. Sakura, are you alright? Sasuke Uchiha, the one who had stopped Zaku's blow mid-flight, spoke to the girl beside him, who was still frozen in shock. Why yeah? She just barely managed to breath out a response, pushing herself off of the floor and backing away. Please refrain from attacking each other outside of the sanctioned fights. He looked over at the man who'd spoken, who even now had yet to remove his hand from Zaku's shoulder. He seemed to be a jonin, and quite obviously from the Leaf Village, judging by the green jacket and the headband. He coughed once or twice into his other hand, though even still, his aura was that of a skilled ninja. I'm sorry, sir, Dosu spoke up from behind him, the last person to have held him back. It won't happen again. The jonin seemed unimpressed, but released Zaku a second later anyways. See that it doesn't. The man spoke before he walked away, moving to stand back in the middle of the arena. Beside him were a few other Leaf jonin, who were all looking over towards their little grouping, as if it were the only interesting thing they'd seen all day. The hell do you think you're doing, anyways? The blonde ninja, who Zaku remembered very vaguely being named Naruto, yelled over at him, walking quite briskly towards him as he continued. You looking to get beaten up by my super jutsu, you bastard? To Zaku's quiet surprise, Dosu stepped in front of the both of them, holding his hand out at the young boy. The proctor has just told us to leave this be. I think it would be wise to follow his advice. What? The other boy didn't seem to agree, bringing his fist up in front of his face and looking like he wanted to say something more, but he was stopped by a hand on his shoulder, this time by the pink-haired kid he'd yelled at just a minute ago. It's alright, Naruto, he didn't hit me. What are you talking about? It doesn't matter if he didn't hit you. He tried to, that's it. Naruto turned back towards him, an angry glint in his eyes. And I don't let anyone lay a hand on my friends. There was a tiny needle of pain in the back of his skull at the boy's words, as if one insignificant memory was trying to show itself. A shouting voice in a cramped back alley, amid dumpsters filled to the brim with unkempt trash, and among rats and bugs crawling on the ground, there was a minuscule, naive little brat, filled with far too much hope for his tiny little frame, that demanded attention. I won't let you hurt him, the boy shouted, drawing his knife out and bringing it down into the adult's face, as many times as he needed until the man's movements ceased. Why you saved me, Zaku? He looked back towards the sound of the voice to find a face filled with residual fear, running with tears. If you hadn't shown up, that bastard, he would've. His friend paled, covering a small cut on his abdomen with his hand. I could have died. It's alright, Reese. He reached down, taking the boy's hand in his own. You're alright. I almost. The boy hiccuped lightly, before huge dollops of tears started to stream down his face, and he sobbed openly. It's okay, Reese. He spoke quietly, trying his best to comfort his only friend. It'll be okay. I'll protect you. Your name is Zaku, right? He was flung back to the present, staring back into the face of the pink-haired girl, Sakura. His anger had died down, but even still, he didn't want to look at her, didn't want to have to think about anything other than the memory that had flashed through his mind. Reese. His head ached as he tried to remember anything else about the boy from that memory just now, but he wasn't able to find anything. Why does that name sound so familiar? Still, the girl asked him a question, and even if he didn't really want to answer, it was better than getting yelled at by her teammates again. Yeah. He was surprised to find his own voice so weak as he spoke, coming out scratchy and quiet. What of it? I won't say sorry, not again. But I will say this. The girl took a deep breath, steeling herself. I'll do my best to see more of the world. I won't pretend like I know everything anymore, so. To his shock, the girl bowed deeply before him. What? Thank you once again. He didn't even possess the strength anymore to get upset with the girl, and instead all he had left was a simple question. Thank me? What for? The girl smiled up at him, so innocently, but carrying just the smallest bit of pain. For opening my eyes. Something in the girl's statement made him hesitate, made him want to respond, but the sound of the doors opening behind them had them all looking backwards. Yo, Sakura! A blonde leaf genin shouted out, waving her hand above her head towards the pink-haired kunoichi. Ah, hey Ino! The girl seemed to welcome the distraction, giving Zaku one last nod before she walked over to her friend, laughing and talking with her as they took their designated places. Dosa put his arm around Zaku's shoulder, leaning into his ear. What the hell was that? He whispered angrily, trying to keep his voice quiet. You're lucky Orochimaru wasn't here. We'd have been killed just like that. Zaku had to smirk at that. Right, I'll keep quiet. Yeah, I completely believe you. Dosu rolled his eyes, sighing quietly as he walked back into his spot, watching and waiting as more people entered into the room. When it seemed everyone had arrived, the third Hokage, who'd entered the room just before the last students, began to speak. He talked about the history of the Chunin exams, what they meant to each of the villages, and how they encouraged cooperation between the villages. Zaku didn't care about a single word that came out of the man's mouth. He couldn't really muster up the energy to, not when he was potentially a few minutes away from the most important fight of his life. And now, I'll hand things over to this exam's proctor, Mr. Haight. The Hokage gestured over towards the same man who'd stopped them earlier, who coughed a few more times into his left fist before he addressed them all. He went over how the fights would be laid out, a random setup of matchups, though, apparently, competitors would be able to face members of their own teams, which was something Zaku hadn't known coming into this. That means, if I get paired against Dosu. He gulped as he tried to ignore that thought. Surely the universe didn't hate him that much. Now I'll ask that if anyone wants to drop out of this stage of the exam, they do so at this time. The proctor spoke, raising his own hand in the air. All you have to do is raise your hand, and a proctor will escort you out. I almost forgot, Orochimaru said his agents leaving once the second stage starts. No one moved, nor was a single hand raised in the air. Wait, what? No one? In that case, please look towards the screen in the back. At that, a giant hole opened up in the back wall, revealing a black screen that flashed with the names of each of the competitors. After a few seconds, 2 names flashed up on the screen, and Zaku was mildly surprised to see a name he knew. Sakura Haruno vs. Yoroi Akado. Anyone who is not one of those 2 fighters, please head to the railings above. You'll be able to locate your sensei from here, please walk to meet them. At those words, Zaku looked above him, seeing in just a moment the disguised Orochimaru, smiling down at them maliciously. Welp, Zaku sighed, trying to calm his fraying nerves. This is it. Yeah, his partner replied. He looked back over at the bandaged boy, smirking lightly. Good luck. Dosu gave a harsh laugh under his breath. Same to you? The fact that Sakura was up first was both a blessing and a curse for the girl. It meant, of course, that she wouldn't have to be constantly fretting about when her match would be called, and that she'd be able to watch the remainder of the fights in relative peace. Unfortunately, it also meant she had approximately 12 seconds to prepare herself mentally for a fight before the proctor began to run down the rules for their bout. Keep it as clean as you can. Accidents happen, but try to resort to lethal force as a last resort, if at all possible. Mr. Haight coughed into his hand, in what Sakura was gradually realizing must have been a condition of some sort. You won't be penalized for it, but just keep that in mind. Yes, sir. She spoke confidently, not really put off by the idea that she'd be facing someone in a duel that could end in either one of their deaths. Honestly, that seemed to be all she'd been doing for the past few weeks now, so this was nothing new. The only thing that bothered her was the slight pain that sprang from the mark on her neck as she looked at the railings above her. That team sensei, Sakura thought as she looked towards the sound duo, and their jonin leader. He gives me the creeps, and the mark on my neck flares up too. Are the both of you ready? Her idle pondering put aside for the moment, Sakura nodded over towards the jonin. The other combatant, who looked to be much older than her, nodded as well. Then, let the first fight of the Chunin exam's second round. The man paused, his hand hovering in the air. Begin! Sakura was weaving signs with her hands the moment the man's hand came down, jumping backwards as she did. The man had a much stockier frame than she did, and she gathered immediately that in a short-range duel, she'd be outmatched in strength. Better to fight at longer range, and use one of the new jutsu she'd picked up in the process. It was a technique that, a bit ironically, came from the rain ninja they'd faced in the Forest of Death. They'd used illusions to clone themselves, fog to hide themselves, but also one lone attack jutsu. She mimicked the movements she'd seen from the rain ninja back in the forest, copied the hand signs, and brought her hand up to her mouth. Water style, water bullet. A harsh stream of water was expelled from her mouth, firing off at high speeds at the ninja before her. What she hadn't expected was for the man to simply tank it on his arms, crossing them over his face and chest and preventing the jutsu from doing any real damage. Crap! Sakura thought, biting her lip as she felt the chakra allotted for the technique run out. The jutsu those guys in the forest used had a lot more stopping power. She knew that she probably shouldn't have tried to use a jutsu for the first time in a real fight, but after sizing up her opponent, she thought this would be the best choice of action. The man moved quickly as her torrent ceased, breaking into her guard with extreme speed. In the second it took him to close the distance, she observed for any weapons the man was carrying, trying to see if she should be blocking with a kunai, but was surprised to see him stretch his bare hand out at her. A martial artist? It certainly wasn't unheard of. Taijutsu was just as legitimate of a practice for someone to specialize in as ninjutsu or genjutsu, and so she brought her arms up to block the strike, counting on her ninja training to tank the blow. It was far softer than she'd imagined, not the palm strike she'd imagined, but instead a grab that soon turned into a grapple. What? She choked out as the man got behind her, one arm around her neck, and the other holding her right arm out to the side. He lifted her a few inches off the ground not a moment later. Humph, let's see what you'll do without any chakra to speak of. Without any chakra. She remembered back to her talk with Zabuza, when she told him about the curse mark. Now listen, I'm not going to tell you not to compete, the man had said, rubbing the back of his neck and sighing deeply. Honestly, I don't think you'd listen even if I said that. You're correct, sir, she answered. I will say this, however. The man raised his finger up at her, pointing directly into her face. If that thing starts acting up, I'm withdrawing you immediately from the exam, got it? What? That's not fair, I can't. You can't control it, right? KCH. The man was right, of course. She had no way of controlling the curse mark. If it activates, I pull you, end of story. Zabuza looked up at her, eyes unapologetic. It's not fair, but kid? That's life. She felt the chakra in her body gradually decline, exiting from where the ninja's hands covered her, one on her right arm, and the other just over her. Just over her curse mark. Does he know? The mark on her neck was starting to hurt a little as more and more of her chakra was sucked out, and she struggled viciously against the man's hold, but found herself unable to escape. Now be a good girl and run out of chakra. The man spoke creepily into her ear, practically breathing on her as he did. It sent a chill up her spine, and a white-hot feeling of fear coursed through her. Think, Sakura! Her inner voice shouted out. What do we have to get this bastard off of us? What did she have? What did she have? Water bullet? No, that wouldn't work, he was behind her. Mud wall? Her hands wouldn't be able to touch the ground. A kunai and some shuriken? Alone, they wouldn't be enough to overcome this man in close quarters. A combination of all three? That could work. She brought her head forward slightly, before, readying herself for the pain, she brought her head back to connect with the man's skull. The man was clearly buffeted by the impact, but he didn't let her go. "That's fine, I don't need you to." She reached her left hand into her bag, and, with a small grunt, thrust the kunai up into the man's stomach. He dropped her with a cry, clutching his chest as a small pool of blood began to pool on it. It wasn't a particularly deep wound or anything, and certainly nothing a doctor wouldn't be able to patch up in a minute or two, but it hadn't needed to be. That was just step one. She forced her hands to move, forming the signs for the jutsu she'd grown accustomed to in the last few weeks. Earth-style, mud wall. She brought her hands to the ground, forming a small, densely packed wall of earth that sprang up in front of the ninja. She had a few seconds at best, and so she reached back into her bag, and with a small smile, brought out the flask that was in there. She took a giant swig of the water, but kept it in her cheeks instead of swallowing it. The man flung himself over the wall, looking annoyed but undeterred. He ran at her, zigzagging slightly as he did, trying to avoid a potential jutsu. That was fine, he was only slowing himself down. Water style, water bullet. She thought to herself, bringing her hand in front of her mouth and trying to use the liquid in her mouth as a catalyst, fired the technique. It was definitely more water, but as she'd feared, it wasn't fired with any more potency in terms of force. The man brought his arms up, tanking the barrage of water with ease. "This all you got, kiddo?" The ninja taunted, stepping towards her slowly. She smirked a second later. "Gotcha." The man screamed as a shuriken impacted his stomach, just below where his arms were guarding. If he hadn't been covering his face, Sakura imagined it would have been easy for the man to stop her attack. But of course, Sakura smirked, feeling more confident than she had in quite a long time as she charged forward. "I planned it all." She slid underneath a clumsy, almost desperate attack from the ninja as he tried in vain to fight off the pain. She kicked off the man's chest, arching into the air in a backflip, and landing a few feet away from where she'd been just a second ago. She looked towards her opponent as she ran forward, seeing the man having fallen onto the floor, still trying to get up even after all of that. "Oh no you don't!" she shouted, leaping forward with a kunai drawn, and landing on top of the other ninja, straddling him as she brought her knife to the man's throat. "Yield!" Yora breathed hard, made a sound of disappointed disgust, and spoke. "I yield." Sakura breathed out in relief as the proctor, who was stood just behind them, called the match, raising his hand in the air and proclaiming her the winner. "Hell yeah!" A loud, almost obnoxious voice sounded out across the entire arena, echoing off the walls and into everyone's ears. "You go Sakura! Team 7 represent!" She looked up to see Naruto with his hands in front of his mouth, forming a makeshift megaphone as he called out his support to her, and to see Sasuke waving, a small smile set upon his face. She waved back to the dark-haired boy and gave the blonde a thumbs up, then turned back towards the proctor, listening to what he had to say. "Well then, Sakura Haruno, you have qualified for the next stage of the Chunin exams. You may choose to exit the arena now, in which case you can head back to your room, or you can join your Jonin-sensei on the railings above. I'll go see my team, then." She smiled up at the man, feeling just a little giddy about the win. The man smiled back at her, before he walked over to the other competitor, watching as a stretcher was brought out, and he was carried off into the medical wing to treat the 2 wounds on his stomach. As she climbed the thin set of stairs to meet her team, Sakura couldn't help but notice another person standing at the top, watching her ascent. The proctor from the Forest of Death? Upon further inspection, her first instinct proved correct. The woman was dressed in the same tan trench coat and fishnets, nothing else adorning her figure as she turned towards the stairs and descended them, walking to meet her halfway. So, the woman Anko, if she recalled, gave her a quick inspection, studying her frame up and down. "You're Sakura Haruno, huh?" She wasn't quite sure what to say, she hadn't spoken to this woman in her life. "Yes?" The woman sighed, looking over her shoulder and back down to the arena, where the competitors were looking antsy to see who would be up next. "Alright, I guess you'll do." The woman took a scroll out of her coat and handed it to Zabuza, who skimmed it briefly before his eyes widened. An order from someone a bit higher up. I'm in charge of training this brat for the next stage of the exam. What? She spoke, confused. What? Her teammates shouted. What? Their stand-in sensei, Zabuza, questioned, looking mildly annoyed. Don't think about it too hard. Enko stepped up to her and grabbed Sakura by the collar, hauling her off of her feet, and carrying her along her back like one would a coat. I'll have her back by 8, I promise. Wait, where are we going? Sakura couldn't help but screech out, feeling more than a little violated. Don't ask dumb questions. The woman spoke back, sighing as she dragged her through one of the doors out of the arena, and into a higher corridor in the tower. What do you mean, dumb questions? I'm being kidnapped. The woman seemed to ponder that for a second, before waving her hand in the air, as if dispelling her argument. Semantics. What do you mean, semantics? As Rock Lee watched his one true love be dragged out of the arena by some unknown woman, he couldn't help but feel the slightest bit confused. Guy-sensei, who was that? He asked his mentor, who was standing just a bit behind him and the rest of his team. That, my students, his teacher looked up, a fearful look in his eyes as he continued, is someone you should hope you never meet. What does that mean? Tenten asked, flipping a kunai on her finger as she turned to look back at her teacher. A demon, Guy whispered as he cowered against the back wall, tears streaming down his face. She's a demon. Right. The only female member of their team sighed, looking back towards the massive screen on the back wall. Still, that was a pretty good fight. I didn't expect Sakura to handle herself so well. Lee caught something in the girl's statement that made him tilt his head. Tenten, have you met Sakura? The girl turned back to look at him, a confused expression on her face, before she seemingly connected the dots. Oh right, yeah, I met Team 7 in the Forest of Death, they're the guys that gave me their Earth Scroll. Niji spoke up, looking at Tenten annoyedly. So they're the reason you were late by a full day. The girl in question coughed into her fist, looking anywhere else but at the Hyuga as she whistled quietly to herself. But isn't Sakura just the most beautiful girl you've ever seen? Lee spoke up, turning back towards the arena with hearts in his eyes. She's perfect. I've decided to dedicate my next fight to her. Tenten sighed, looking over at him with a disappointed expression. Right, well, you have fun with that. Pay attention, Niji, their self-appointed leader, spoke assertively, gesturing to the black screen at the back of the hall. They're announcing the next fighters. The names on the screen flashed by quickly, never remaining more than for a few tenths of a second. Lee only caught a few, mostly the ones he knew. Naruto, Sasuke, Tenten, Niji, Lee, and he briefly caught the name Gaara scattered among them as well. When the machine finally stopped, Lee felt the air in his lungs evacuate his body, and he had to grip the railing in front of him to keep from shaking. Their teacher patted Lee on the back, leaning over his shoulder. This is it, Lee. This is what you've been training for. The man gave him a pearly smile, his expression confident. Go on and show him how strong you really are. His hands were shaking as he brought them up in front of him. It wasn't nerves, no, it might have been, but that wasn't all that was there. It was excitement, because this was finally the moment of truth. Niji Hyuga versus Rock Lee. Oh? His teammate looked back over at him, the pale eyes of the Hyuga clan narrowed, forming a small, competitive expression. Well, I suppose we can finally settle this once and for all, no? Yeah, Lee spoke, quieter and more serious than he had ever been. He brought his arms up before him, and unclenching his left hand into an open palm, slammed his right fist into it. Would genius prevail, proving once and for all that effort could never truly match talent? Or would his own training, going against what everyone he'd ever met had told him, show the world the value of hard work? He couldn't wait to prove himself. Finally! Chapter 18. Lee practically vibrated in place as he waited on the white stone floor of the arena for his match to begin. He'd been taught by his sensei to analyze situations carefully, for without chakra, he began almost any confrontation at a disadvantage, and needed any information he could get. He felt terrible, but he couldn't mind that advice, not when the subject of his training, the boy he'd been itching to fight for over a year now, was finally stood before him. I'll quickly go over the rules for this bout. The coughing proctor spoke quietly, beginning to read off of a small clipboard he held in his hands, though Lee couldn't focus on that. His sensei's advice, the last thing he told him just before he descended the large set of stairs into the arena, kept echoing in his head. This is it, Lee. The man looked down on him excitedly, smiling in that way that was so bright it was off-putting to anyone else but himself. What you've trained for, what you fought for, what you've bled and cried for. Yes. He nodded along, sensing the pep talk before his teacher even really started it. I won't take too long with this, mostly because you only have 3 minutes to prepare. The man trailed off, narrowing his eyes towards the screen at the back of the room. And, you're both my students. I will not be giving you any special help against Niji, or telling you his weaknesses. Lee nodded. He wouldn't need them. He'd been training against the boy for over a year, had hit him, been hit by him, well over 1,000 times. He knew the ins and outs of the Hyuga's fighting style, just as Niji did his own. I will tell you this alone, however, his sensei stood a bit taller than normal, perhaps swelling a small amount with pride at seeing the culmination of their efforts. Go all out from the very beginning, do not give Niji the chance to think, for he will use it, and use it well. Behind them, Tenten sighed, her eyes narrowed as she looked between them. Didn't you just say you wouldn't help him? Guy seemed to ponder that for a moment, before, in what seemed to be a moment of clarity, he slapped his hand over his own mouth, likely not trusting himself to be quiet. He held his other hand out towards Lee, giving him a gusto-filled thumbs up, before he walked to stand next to Tenten, observing the arena below them. Are the both of you ready? The question brought Lee's mind back to the present, and he gave his own affirmation around the same time that his teammate did, looking over at the boy without any hesitation. I'm going to win, Niji. His opponent seemed almost surprised at the tone of his voice. So crystal clear, so absolutely sure that he was correct. The Hyuga's eyes narrowed, though a small smile split his face a second later. I doubt it, but it's always good to dream big, I suppose. Their rivalry wasn't a friendly one, not overly so. They were still teammates, however, and that meant that they did, at the very least, get along decently well. They could support one another on the battlefield, could identify weaknesses in the other's abilities, and had helped each other reach new heights. There was no need for any further words. Both were dead set in their convictions. Both knew for a fact that they were in the right. And so, with a determined expression, Lee took his stance, one hand held before him, with the other behind his back. Niji did the same, arching himself forward, making a T with his arms and body as he leaned towards him. A traditional gentle fist stance. He'd seen it 1.5 million times. He'd beaten it only a few. He swallowed his sudden bout of nerves, they would do him no good. The proctor looked between the two of them, and apparently having decided that they were ready to begin, rose his hand in the air. Let the second match of the Chunin exam's second exam. His hand was brought swiftly downwards, cutting a path through the air as it came to a stop. Begin! Neither of them was still for more than a moment, either of them had any reason to be. Even if Niji could use chakra, he prioritized the gentle fist and its techniques over any ninjutsu he could have cast in the same time, and Lee could see why. It was a powerful strike that met him in the center of the ring, and it nearly knocked him backwards as he allowed the palm to crash against the back of his right arm. Anyone else wouldn't have been able to use such a reckless defense, but for Lee, it wasn't a problem. He had no need to make chakra flow through his arms to cast jutsu, seeing as he had no chakra at all. A few traded blows later, none of which had any effect on either of them, and the two broke apart, sailing backwards a few feet, and sizing one another up. In a normal sparring session between the two of them, Lee was fairly sure Niji would have simply charged in again, counting on his better-than-average reaction time, along with his Byakugan, in order to dodge whatever he could throw at him. But for the both of them, this was more than a spar. They were both just a little more hesitant, acting cautiously at the start, to avoid making any mistakes out of the get-go. His opponent gave a small chuckle, bringing his hand up to his face, and holding it directly in front of his nose, brought out the power of his bloodline. Byakugan. The customary veins flowed out from his eyes, and Lee realized that, if the boy was taking him this seriously, then it was only right for him to release his own limiters. He dropped down into a kneel, reaching into the leg warmers around his calves, and drawing out the weights that resided there. He could hear a few people above them laughing, probably wondering just what the hell removing some weights was going to do. The laughter stopped when he threw them away from him, and they hit the ground with an almighty crash, sending small pieces of stone spiraling into the air. He charged at his teammate, not bothering to try and attack him from the side, or from behind, knowing there was virtually no difference with his Byakugan activated. The boy intercepted his strike, making a smart decision in hunkering down in that spot, using his Byakugan and gentle fist to meet his blows at any angle. It didn't matter if he were the faster of the two of them if Niji never tried to outmaneuver him. As he landed a ways away again, taking a breath after his last volley, he was surprised to find the Hyuga already on him, and he just barely managed to block a blow meant for his left side, and subsequently, his heart, with his left elbow. He winced as he felt the bones in his arm creak, but knew there was no way around the pain. It would have been incredibly naive to think he could fight Niji Hyuga, arguably the strongest ninja in their year, and come out without a single injury. They broke apart, and Lee felt it was about time to accept that they were evenly matched at this stage. Niji had prepared a strategy for his speed, and even if it was a simple one, born of his eye's ability more than anything, it was still effective. Around this time, against anyone else, he would have brought out his lotuses, but not against Niji. The Hyuga had been a big help in his learning of the ability, though perhaps only unconsciously, occasionally observing the technique in its earliest stages, and giving him ideas for how to use it. Untying the wrappings around his arms would have been a signal for the ninja across from him, and it would have said, "Here's what I'm going to do, counter it." Instead, he concentrated for a moment, breathing deeply as he mentally reached out for the first gate. The first gate of opening. Release. A field of force surrounded him, and he couldn't help but revel in his own power as he felt the ground around him crack. This was the result of hard work, and nothing else. No special eye, no ingrained talent, pure, unadulterated effort, and he would prove its strength, right here, right now. Though he couldn't help but narrow his eyes as he looked at his opponent. The Hyuga wasn't gasping in surprise, or even looking worried about his chances. He was smiling. "Come, Lee." The boy spoke simply, once more adopting his signature stance, leaning forward with his arms splayed. He was more than happy to accept his teammate's invitation, charging forwards with an almost inhuman speed. He caught Niji before he could properly raise his guard, delivering a kick into his chest, and sending the boy spiraling backwards along the ground. A part of him, that considered Niji a good friend, and didn't really want to hurt him, told Lee to give him a second to stand. The rest of him kept charging, flying over the boy and preparing to rain a blow down from above, but his leg was intercepted, the Hyuga on the ground smirking as the two grappled for just a moment, ending with Lee being thrown off, landing a few feet away. "That all you have, Lee?" His opponent taunted, taking his stance once again, though with a minor adjustment. This time, he bent his right hand forward, better for intercepting frontward blows. But Lee didn't miss the small amount of blood that dripped out from the boy's nose, even if the Hyuga tried to catch it before he could. He zigzagged forward, trying to throw Niji off as he got into his range, and had to back away as the Hyuga brought forth one of his most deadly attacks, the 8 trigrams 64 palms. He narrowly evaded the technique, letting the boy's palms sail over his head as he ducked under them, but now found himself on the back foot, dodging blow after blow as the boy came at him. "So even with the first gate, we're still evenly matched?" Lee pondered, taking the time to think as the two finally came to a standstill, circling one another as they both came up with new plans. "I suppose the next gate." "No. The third gate. I'll surprise him with its power, and use that to claim victory." Lee focused hard on trying to disguise the effort of opening another gate, even as he breathed heavily and forced his energy to travel down his spine, past the second gate, and straight to the third. He felt the telltale burning sensation along his spine that signaled the third gate's release just as Niji charged at him, apparently done coming up with a plan. It wouldn't matter, Lee had him. the third gate of life. Release. He didn't miss the way Niji's eyes widened, trying to backpedal out of Lee's effective range, but both boys knew that it was already too late. I've got you! He rocketed forwards, his fists moving through the air at a speed that was almost unforeseen at a genin level, and he couldn't help but wince slightly as he felt his friend's flesh give beneath his blows. Niji shot backwards, but Lee knew he couldn't stop, couldn't rest, until his opponent could no longer move. The Hyuga was simply too talented to underestimate. He practically slid across the floor as his legs moved faster than they should have been able to. The gates allowed him to surpass his body's limitations, but that did come at a price. He knew that if he didn't end this fight within the next minute or two, then the pain would eat him alive. Still, as he looked towards his teammate, seeing the boy's eyes glazed over, he couldn't help but feel that the Hyuga wouldn't be able to fight him anymore. The boy took an incredibly loose stance, and it seemed like he knew he had lost, for he grit his teeth in annoyance. Let's do this. I'm ending this, Niji, he shouted as he jumped over his opponent, preparing to finally break out his lotus, now that he was sure the boy was too out of it to counter him. Or he should have been, but Lee noticed too late that the Hyuga's eyes were sharper than they should have been, conveying not that he was out of the match, but that he was merely pretending to be. He was already riding the air though, and that meant he had no choice but to engage his opponent, choosing to flip behind Niji, in an effort to surprise him. He'd been attacking purely from the front for their entire fight, and he hoped that by finally attacking from behind, the boy would be caught off guard. Pain shot up his back, and it all came from a small, almost pinpoint strike by Niji's fingers. It was aimed directly at the third gate, the midpoint of his spine. His attack stopped, and he froze in place there, just in front of the boy, as his entire body seemed to cease to function for just a moment. Move! Move! He recovered a moment later, but by then, he'd already been standing still for half a second. And that had been all his opponent needed. 8 trigrams 64 palms. 2 palms. He was bombarded by 2 strikes, hitting his back and his arm, respectively. He just managed to turn towards the blows as the next volley began, the shock from having the third gate's energy cut wearing off just in time for him to get his arms up. But he wondered if it would be enough. 4 palms. He managed to take those on his arms, blocking each one individually, and hunkering down for the remaining 58 palms, hoping that he could block them all. 8 palms. One got through, a hit directly to his left shoulder, as Niji struck out from around his guard, like a serpent. 16 palms. 3 more through his guard, hitting his stomach, chest, and 1 to his collarbone, which he was fairly certain broke from the impact. 32 palms. Now his guard was practically non-existent, and he took most of the blows from the jutsu, most hitting his chest and stomach. 64 palms. He was knocked backwards from Niji's final attack, landing on the ground a ways away from him, and finding himself unable to move. The Hyuga's exasperated breaths were the only thing he could hear, as the people above them, those watching, had all gone completely silent. Heh! The boy walked over to stand above him, just where Lee could see him out of the corner of his eye. Guess that's that, Lee. Hard work alone cannot defeat destiny. Niji turned around, and this time, spoke to the proctor. He won't be moving again for a few hours, probably best to call the match now. Something in the boy's words caused him to stir. He could feel the pain catching up to him, now that he wasn't moving anymore. His arms and legs felt like jelly, his core, which had been bombarded by Niji's gentle fist, felt like it was crumbling into pieces, and his gates had been deactivated manually from a hit to his spine, which was constantly shooting pain up his body. And yet even so, he reached his hand out, putting his weight on it, and did his very best to stand. Something was wrong that, at least, Niji could tell. It wasn't just that the proctor made no moves to end the match, but that the audience above them, who had gone silent after he'd taken down his teammate, were now stirring once more. He felt a white-hot anger nearly overtake him as he turned around, and found his opponent trying his absolute hardest to stand. What the hell? His voice came out without him realizing it. He couldn't help it, he knew that the boy should have been out after that. His lotus would be ineffective against him. His previous weights had been tossed aside, the speed he'd gained hadn't been enough to match him, and even his precious gates had been closed off, sealed by Niji's chakra. So how the hell can he still move? He tried to advance towards Lee, tried to prevent the boy from rising, but found his legs nearly giving out on him as he walked, falling to his knees as he did. In his gambit to deactivate Lee's gates, he put himself in the firing line, knowing that he'd take some hits from the Bulkhead ninja, yet thinking that he'd be able to withstand them easily. But his teammate had hit far harder than he'd thought him capable of, and he was paying for his own hubris now. He felt a voice in the back of his head scream that this was all wrong, that Lee couldn't stand, that destiny wouldn't allow him to stand, and yet, even still, the boy's body wouldn't stop rising. "I shut down your gates," he screamed out, feeling fury course into his voice as he too rose, ignoring the sharp pain that coursed through him. "I flooded your internal systems with my chakra. You shouldn't be able to move, let alone stand. So how the hell are you?" Niji tried to contain his anger as the boy across from him actually smirked, his eyes barely opened as he seemed to fade from in and out of consciousness. "Because you said I couldn't?" He gritted his teeth, feeling his rage trying to best him. "Out of spite? You do all of that, just out of spite?" "Of course not." Lee spoke simply as he brought his hand up before him in his usual stance. It was looser than usual, and his arms shook from exhaustion, but the look on his face told Niji that the boy wouldn't let it fall. "I'm doing this to prove something to everyone, to prove something to you, but above all else, to prove something to myself." Niji took a step forward, trying to adopt his stance by leaning forward, but his ribs screamed at him as he tried, and so he adopted a normal Hyuga stance, one hand in front of him, the other directly next to his breast, acting as a second line of defense. Hard work beats talent, unless talent works hard. It was the same spiel as always. The same thing Gai-sensei told them all whenever they would spar, the same thing his star pupil would parrot back at him every single time he said it, and it was the last straw for Niji's patience. "You think hard work can overcome destiny?" he screamed as he charged in, raining blow after blow on the boy. "You think you can defeat fate with effort alone?" Every single one of his strikes was blocked by Lee, this time not with his arms, but with his hands, literally meeting him blow for blow. "Isn't that what you think as well?" This time, Lee struck him, sending him flying backwards. As he landed, he pivoted, just barely managing to stay standing as the boy charged back at him. "I've seen you training in the forest, Niji." His teammate was shouting, a rarity for the bowl-cut-bearing boy, but that wasn't what shocked the Hyuga the most. "You! No one was supposed to know about that," he shouted, sneaking a two-fingered assault into Lee's ribs, making the boy cough up a small amount of blood as he backpedaled. "How did you figure it out?" "You can't hide from us, Niji!" Lee screamed out, and the voice reverberated on the walls above them. "I said that hard work beats talent, but that was unless talent works hard as well." Lee took a stance, this time, his eyes were clear, any and all doubt gone. "Even you are trying to change your own so-called fate, aren't you?" His eyes widened at his teammate's words. "Am I?" He'd been training, secretly, every single day since he'd become a genin. He pretended to slack off, pretended to believe himself so far above everyone else, and yet he couldn't help but cry out in anger and rage as his efforts still didn't bear any fruit in the one field he wanted them to. They still couldn't change the Hyuga. So what? I can't change that accursed clan. His anger was carrying through to his voice, spittle flying in all directions as he screamed to the world, and once more he met Lee in the center of the arena, strong fist colliding with gentle fist. "I'll never be able to change them, and I know that now. I was an idiot before, thinking I could." "You still think you can?" A fist connected with the side of his face, and his vision distorted, even as he tried to block the next few blows. What? You never gave up, and you shouldn't," Lee argued, pushing into his guard, and delivering a quick 1-2 that knocked Niji completely off balance, sending him to the floor. "You can change the Hyuga clan. And you will. You can't tell me that you trained day in and day out, through rain or shine, all because you thought that destiny bound you." Is Lee encouraging me? He blocked the blow, aiming to finish him off, the same kick that Lee had already aimed for twice now, and then blocked the follow-up to that as well, spinning the boy around him and throwing him a foot or so away. There's no shame for me, losing here, not to someone who I know for a fact is trying just as hard as I am. Lee spoke simply, smiling, even with the blood that streamed out of his now broken nose. But even still, Niji, I will not lose this duel. A small laugh broke from him, even as he tried to hold it in. It was useless, however, and a second later, he found himself cracking up, giggling like some schoolgirl as he took his own stance, preparing to face his teammate in one final exchange. Neither will I. They both charged forwards, preparing their best blows for combat. 8 trigrams. Primary. 64 palms. Lotus. He fired blow after blow into Lee, even as the boy's bandages covered him, and they soared into the air. He was able to open his palm over the bowl cut bearing ninja's stomach and shot chakra directly into it in an effort to disrupt his internal organs. Lee coughed up blood, but didn't cease, bringing them both crashing into the floor as smoke billowed around them. Niji had been grabbed by the primary lotus before, and he knew the way around it was to shield his neck at all costs. It still hurt, oh boy did it hurt, but it didn't take him out of the fight completely. And yet, it seemed the built-up damage from their previous exchanges just might. Even as he tried to rise to meet his teammate once more in combat, he found his legs unresponsive. Though it seemed like the boy across from him was much the same. He collapsed onto the floor, feeling his consciousness fading as he smiled widely, feeling just a small bit of his curse's weight subside as he saw Lee's eyes closing, the strong fist user losing out to his own exhaustion. So hard work really can contest destiny, huh? That seems fair. He lost consciousness a second later. Ino watched the proctor walk over to the two boys in the arena, examine them both, and then raise his hands in the air. Both fighters are unable to continue, thusly, this match concludes in a draw. A draw? She questioned, looking behind her, where her teammates Shikamaru and Choji stood, but also where their sensei, Asuma, was watching the match with vague interest. What happens when there's a draw, teacher? Both fighters get eliminated. He spoke simply, taking a small puff of his cigarette, and then shaking off the chaff onto the ground. And the bracket for the next stage gets a hell of a lot more confusing. I guess that's the only option. Shikamaru spoke simply, shrugging. Can't really let them both go on, or else you'd have everyone trying to make deals with their opponents to move into the next round for free. That sounds like something you'd do, Shikamaru. Choji joked, elbowing his friend in the side. The boy in question closed his eyes, leaned back against the wall behind him, and smiled lazily. Yeah, I probably would. Next fight's up soon, Asuma said casually, gesturing with his elbow towards the screen on the back wall, which was now cycling through names. Pretty good chance one of you all's going up as well, so pay attention. Ino waited with bated breath, hoping that she wouldn't get picked, and then also kind of hoping she would. It would be nice to simply be done with this and not have to worry about it. When the screen stopped, she groaned loudly. Ino Yamanaka vs. Gaara. Welp, everyone, I'd like it to go on record I gave the exam my best effort. Ino sighed out, looking up towards her sensei with narrowed eyes. Am I allowed to forfeit now? The man looked down on her with a small smile. At least try and fight him, please? But he's scary. Haven't you seen him? Teammate told us that he killed a few kids in the forest. Asuma stroked his beard, seeming a bit concerned, but not overly so. Alright, how about this? Go down there and give it your best. If you feel like you're outmatched, just concede. Asuma's eyes got a little darker all of a sudden, and he took another puff of his cigarette. If the boy threatens you in any way, I'll go down there and back you up. Sound good? That did help her to relax a bit, and she breathed out a lot of her nerves in the next few seconds. Why yeah. That sounds good, sensei. The man smiled down at her. Good, now go get him. She turned back towards the arena to see the kid named Gaara literally materialize into the arena, having turned himself into sand. Sensei, I give up. At least try. He turned into sand, I'm sure a lot of people can do that. I'm sure you're full of bullshit, sensei. Ahem. The proctor just before her cleared his throat, causing her to jump as she turned to look at him. If you're finished. Oh, yeah, right. Very well, I'll go over the rules for this competition. The man turned back towards the center arena and began to tell them about how lethal force was authorized, but not recommended. He went over a few things, but really, Ino couldn't help but worry about what the hell the boy in front of her was about. Are you both ready? Gaara merely nodded, whereas she gave a semi-enthusiastic sure. Then, let the third match of the Chunin exam's second round begin. All right. She decided to go all out from the start, bringing her hands up in front of her in their clan's signature sign. Mind-body switch technique. Welp, this probably won't work, but at least after it fails I can concede with GR. Suddenly, she found herself in the red-headed boy's mind, looking over at her own body. Wait, did that actually work? Huh, guess this guy's a pushover then. A terrible voice called out from all around her, echoing in the expanses of the boy's mind. Who the hell are you? She turned around, shaking slightly as she did, and found her eyes widening at what she saw. It was a massive beast, perhaps 100 feet tall on its own, and it looked to Ino to be made of sand. It had blue etchings running down its entire body in odd patterns, and its eyes were terrifying, glowing an ominous yellow in the darkest recesses of Gaara's mind. She screamed as she released her hold on the boy, and flew back to her own body, stumbling carelessly as she tried to get away. She fell backwards onto her butt, panting as she tried to get over what she'd seen. A second later, the boy across from her, confusion written all over his face, narrowed his eyes, and brought his hand up before him, looking ready to attack. Ino's own hand flew up before he could. I surrender! Across from her, Gaara's eyes widened slightly, as did those of the proctors, who walked over to her. You are yielding? Why, yes, sir! The man seemed to consider her for a second, before shrugging and calling the match. Ino Yamanaka has yielded, the winner is Gaara. Everyone above them seemed a bit confused, and honestly, Ino couldn't find it in herself to blame them for that. To them, it probably seemed like she had the advantage, and then suddenly conceded the match. But she'd seen it, the monster inside of that boy, and she'd known she wanted nothing to do with it. You surrender? The voice was almost tiny, what with how quiet it was, though Ino still caught it. She turned back towards the red-haired boy who'd spoken, looking almost confused. How do I answer this? Ah, yeah, sorry. Ino rubbed the back of her neck sheepishly. You were probably looking forward to a match, but I'm not really all that. Ino! The voice shocked her into action, and she ducked just underneath an almost sharp pile of sand as it blazed past where her head had been just moments ago. She stumbled backwards, looking back over at the boy who'd attacked her, but found him standing ramrod straight, a knife at his throat already. She surrendered, kid? Asuma spoke, his cigarette still in his other hand as he let Gaara go, shoving him back towards his own staircase. That means it's over. Get back to your team. The redhead turned back around, eyes hard as he stared up at her teacher's face. Why do you care? If she surrendered, then she forfeited her life, didn't she? The boy brought his hands together, and the sand from before seemed to grow almost agitated, writhing on the floor as it was pulled back into the boy's gourd. I should be able to do whatever I want to her, she gave up. Yeah, well, her teammates aren't giving up on her. Asuma spoke, crossing his arms as he looked at the boy with a deadpan expression. So, run along now, before I do something we'll both regret. Gaara seemed about ready to protest even that, but for a hand on his shoulder. It was his own Jonin-sensei, a man who wore a cloth over half of his face. I apologize. The man spoke, not sounding very sorry. Please excuse his actions. Come, Gaara. The boy in question looked up at his teacher, scowled, but nodded. The two ascended the stairway, Gaara in front, with his teacher in the back. I'm sorry, Ino. Asuma spoke, eyes narrowed as he kept watch of those two. I should have listened to you when you said you wanted to drop out. That kid was more dangerous than I thought he'd be. He was, yeah, Aino spoke quietly, still in shock from when she narrowly dodged that sand attack earlier. It had been coming at her quick enough that it might have dug into her had it landed, and then. She shivered, trying her best not to think about it. But still, she couldn't help but wonder. Just what the hell was that monster inside that boy's head? Chapter 19. Alright, Miss Kidnapper Lady. I resent that. Good for you. Sakura hissed out. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, what the hell is it we're doing? Enko had taken her through numerous rooms and hallways in the large tower that housed the Chunin exam's second test, until they'd finally arrived in a room that looked a bit like the arena they'd previously occupied. It was smaller, much smaller, but it was rather well lit, and would easily accommodate mock battles, which she assumed was the space's purpose. We're sparring? The woman answered, looking at Sakura as if she were stupid. What else would we be doing? Sakura tried to internalize the annoyance she was feeling, but, judging by the deep sigh that poured out of her a moment later, she was fairly sure it hadn't worked. Alright, fine, what am I doing? Enko looked around the room, her hand massaging the tip of her chin as she seemed to ponder something. She pulled a kunai out of her bag and sat down, bringing the sharp edge down onto the cold stone floor beneath them, carving a shallow circle around her. Okay, the woman stood back up, stretching as she continued to speak. You can do whatever you want to me. Try and stab me to death, or throw bombs at me, or use whatever jutsu you want, but your only real goal is to knock me out of this circle. Sakura was just a tad confused as to the point of this. You're not going to teach me anything? Her new mentor stared back at her, a stick of dango in her mouth, already looking a bit bored. Wasn't planning on it, no? Then, what's the point of this? Oh, right, Enko pulled the now empty stick out of her mouth, taking a small moment to chew, and then spoke up again. I just wanted to see your curse mark once you get all freaked out and angry. I'm not actually expecting you to beat me. Sakura felt the small bubble of annoyance, the one she'd been keeping down ever since this woman had pulled her away from her friends, begin to fester. She felt a real, palpable rage as the woman laughed at her, even if she knew that was just what her new mentor wanted. The woman snickered under her breath. I'm honestly not even expecting you to hit me, so don't worry about. A torrent of water connected with Enko's body, drenching her from head to toe. She sat in what seemed to be mortification for a moment, before looking back up at Sakura, who was doing her best to avoid showing the joy she currently felt on her face. What was that you said? Sakura asked, trying not to break out into giggles as her smile grew to shit-eating proportions. About not hitting you? Enko's expression grew dark, and just for a moment, she thought she might have pissed the woman off, but a second later, her new teacher laughed, arching backwards and holding herself up with her arms. Oh, Sakura. The woman's expression grew almost feral as she stepped outside of her makeshift circle, drawing her weapon in front of her, and disregarding the rules she'd previously set. I think I'm going to like you. So, is anyone gonna talk about Sakura or… Nah, Zabuza's attention never left the arena below them, even as he yawned, using the back of his hand to cover his bandaged mouth. She'll be fine. You sound awfully sure of that. Sasuke spoke from beside Naruto, his eyes narrowed in minor annoyance. Yeah, well, that woman did have a missive from the Hokage. We can say whatever we want, but that old man wanted that her training Sakura, so we don't have a choice. Naruto couldn't help but feel like that was just a bit unfair, but decided to keep those thoughts to himself as he looked around, trying to find their leader's shadow around the arena. Hey, Zabuza? Naruto asked, turning back to look at his stand-in teacher. I thought you would have brought Haku with you. Where's he at? That brat? The assassin hissed out, annoyance making its way into his tone. He's over there, enjoying the spoils of war. Naruto followed the man's finger, over to where Shikamaru, Choji, and Ino, along with their sensei, were standing along the opposite balcony to them. Upon second inspection, he noticed that there was another figure standing just beside the blonde girl of the group, making idle conversation with her. Someone's gotta comfort her after her loss, he said. I guess I'll have to go and talk with her, he said. Zabuza growled under his breath, accidentally bending the iron bar supporting his weight. Damned idiot doesn't see that his puppy crush is the most obvious thing in all of shinobi history. Sasuke coughed, and then, when Zabuza turned to look at him with a deadpan expression, he began to whistle. Don't think I haven't been noticing the looks you've been giving your girl either. Zabuza sighed, massaging his face with his hands. I'm happy to know that I, at least, was never this bad. What? Sasuke spoke up, a small blush on his cheeks as he spat out denials. After a second, the boy seemed to become fed up with Zabuza's accusations. What the? I'm sure you were just as much of an idiot as all the rest of us are. Zabuza chuckled, looking back towards Sasuke with an eyebrow raised. I doubt it. Why's that? I literally killed everyone I went to school with. Zabuza outlined in a bored tone. Couldn't really fall for a corpse, now could I? There was a moment of silence as both Sasuke and Naruto remembered the man's story, before Sasuke spoke a second or two later with a quiet "Oh." Now quiet, next match. Naruto tried his very best to forget about Zabuza's murder-filled past, turning towards the screen and silently hoping he'd be chosen. He'd been sitting around on this balcony doing nothing at all for far too long. When the screen came to a stop, Naruto jumped up, raised his fist in the air, and gave a mighty whoop. Temari vs. Naruto Uzumaki. Finally! He exclaimed, finding himself a bit short of breath as he ran towards the stairs, taking them two at a time in his rush to get to the center of the arena. Finally, I get to fight! By the time he made it down, which was maybe 15 seconds later, his opponent was already there. She was a blonde girl a few years older than him, wearing a fairly simple dress and what seemed to be a fishnet underoutfit, which Naruto couldn't help but think mustn't have covered much. She also wore a giant metal object across her back, although judging from how one of her hands was resting upon it, Naruto couldn't help but think she would draw the instrument the moment their fight began. The proctor talked to them about the rules of their fight, going over the same things he had with everyone else, but Naruto had been listening to him during Sakura's fight, concerned for his friend, and had already heard it all. He instead chose to use that time devising a strategy from what he could see of the girl in front of him. Well, to start, she's going to be using that thing on her back for something, or else she wouldn't be lugging it around. Naruto concluded fairly obviously, scratching his chin. The problem is that it could be anything, but I won't really know until the fight starts. It aggravated him to know that no amount of thinking, something he'd resolved to use to try and be a better fighter, would actually help him this time around. Fine. I guess I'll have to adapt on the fly. Naruto smirked, taking a stance as the proctor asked the two if they were ready. He drew a kunai from his pouch and prepared to summon a few shadow clones as soon as the fight started. If there was one thing Naruto knew he was good at, it was bullshitting his way out of difficult situations. He was fairly confident he'd be fine. Then let the fourth match of the Chunin exam's second round begin. Naruto raised his hands into the shadow clone almost immediately, allowing 4 clones to pop up around him, and had them all immediately charge forward, just to get a read on what he'd be dealing with. His eyes widened when, a second later, every single one of them was banished in a single swing of the girl's weapon, which turned out to be a massive fan. The winds that blew across the arena even buffeted him back, despite him being a good 20 feet away. Well, that's interesting. Naruto thought to himself, already running small scenarios in his head for what he should do about this new development. Not good, of course, but interesting. He wasn't surprised when the girl took a few steps back, creating distance between the two of them with a small smile on her face all the while. Alright, idea number 1. This girl's a long-range fighter, and she doesn't want to get close. Let's test it. He took a step forward and felt a small sense of satisfaction as the girl mirrored his action, stepping back with the same foot. She was retaining the distance between them. So, idea number 1 proven. Idea number 2, if I get close to her, I can win a close-range fight. That one was a little iffier, but Naruto felt like it was his safest bet at present. His opponent shot off a large gust his way, and he couldn't even try to dodge with how big it was. He instead chose to put his hands in front of his face, and take the blast on his arms. He was rewarded with slices down his sleeves, as the sharp winds bit and tore into his clothes, and more worryingly, his flesh. When he lowered his arms, he couldn't help but notice that the girl rested the fan behind her, smirking to herself in satisfaction. A small idea began to form in the back of his mind. Alright, so Sasuke says to analyze anything that seems weird, so why wouldn't she just keep bombarding me with that wind? Naruto couldn't help but wonder as he sent out another few shadow clones, just to buy him time to think. I mean, even if it takes an immense amount of chakra, I'm still going to be down after 6 or 7 of those. Naruto kept his train of thought going as he narrowly dodged out of the way of the slicing gale, and then ducked underneath a kunai the girl threw at him a second later, which only served to further his thought process. Okay, so a kunai is obviously inferior to a blast from her fan, so that leads me to only one conclusion. She can't use that fan attack continuously. He looked back to her, as she drew the fan along her back and seemed to sit idle for a moment. An idea came to him. Is she charging it? It made sense, after all, if after every single blow she seemed to hesitate to follow up, then that could only mean she needed the time to charge for another strike. He decided to bank on this theory, and instead of backing off when she dispersed the next set of clones, he charged in. The girl's eyes widened for just a moment, before, in a move that caught him off guard, she swung her fan at him a second time. What? But I thought. It was too late to dodge, and it was going to hit him dead center. Naruto could do nothing but raise his arms as he was knocked backwards, landing several feet away and rolling pitifully to a stop. He rose immediately, not wanting to be declared unfit to continue, but found his legs weak as he did. He looked down at them, and found himself bleeding from several cuts all over his body. Feeling a bit woozy as well. He could vaguely remember Irika-sensei telling him that was bad. Like really bad. Humph. The girl across from him had a cocky smile on her face, her fan drawn back across her back with a victorious expression adorning her features. Honestly, if that's all you can do, then please spare us all the effort and just concede already. I'm getting bored. His anger flared up, and he could feel, with a small sense of relief, a few of the cuts around his body start to heal themselves as a minuscule amount of the Ninetales chakra coursed through him. He knew that he should analyze the situation calmly, think carefully about his next move, and execute on a plan. That was what Sasuke had taught him, and at this point, he knew that the boy was right far more often than not. But the anger boiling inside him told him to summon a few dozen shadow clones, grit his teeth, and punch that girl square in the jaw. And that was just what he'd do. Talk down to me. Naruto brought his hands up in front of him, but before he could use a good half his chakra on a veritable army of shadow clones, a shouting voice called out to him. Idiot! Don't fall for it! He turned back around, a bit dumbfounded, and looked up towards Sasuke, who was breathing heavy, sweat dripping down his face as he called out with all his might. You're angry, right? Well, use it! The boy held his fist out, smiling widely. Prove you're stronger. Use my anger? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Wait, could he mean? He smirked before letting his hands fall back to his sides, abandoning the army of shadow clones he'd been about to summon, and instead raised his fist up to mirror his friend's. Will do, Sasuke. The Uchiha gave him one last encouraging smile, before Naruto turned back around, cracking his knuckles, and beginning to circle the girl in the center of the arena. I get it, Sasuke. You're saying that she's trying to get me riled up, so she can use my anger against me. Naruto nodded sagely, feeling proud that he was able to decipher his friend's code. You didn't want to shout it out, though, because if she understood she'd been found out, then she'd abandon her strategy. Naruto smirked, nodding. Right. If I were to use 50 shadow clones, they'd just dissipate the moment the girl hit them with a single strike. But what if I were to use that same amount of chakra on one single shadow clone? He'd tried it before, just the once, when he'd been sparring with Sasuke. It hadn't been particularly useful, not against the boy's fireball jutsu, which had hit it straight onto the face, but Naruto had a theory that, against something less destructive, the clone would be able to take more than a single hit before dissipating. Especially against an attack as indirect as Tamari's wind. Still, There's no way I'll know until I use it, and if I do, and it fails, that's half of my chakra down the drain. But there was no way he was going to be Hokage one day without being willing to take some risks. He brought his hands up, focused hard upon the chakra that swirled within him, took a generous portion of it, and then said the words. Shadow Clone Jutsu. A single, solitary puff of white smoke enveloped him, and after it cleared, there was another copy of him to his left. His doppelganger looked towards him, smirked, and nodded. The girl before him must have sensed something was up, because she took a few steps back, reached into her ninja tool bag, and drew forth a contraption Naruto knew quite well. Paper bomb! He exclaimed, dodging to the right as his clone did to the left, avoiding the explosion that went off where he'd just been standing. He looked back over towards the girl with a small grimace, but his eyes widened a second later as a massive squall came towards him, carrying pieces of the floor with it as it cut its way across the arena. That's bad, was pretty much the only thing Naruto could vocalize before he was bombarded by blades of streaming wind. He did his very best to avoid taking any serious damage, but couldn't quite stop the cuts from adding up on his body, legs, arms, and chest. He fell to the floor in a heap, the ground cracking around him as he did. And yet, in a moment when his defeat was all but certain, an idea came to him. He kept his laughter to himself as he did, feeling the cuts on his body begin to patch themselves up. The reason why his opponent swung her fan back across her back every time she attacked, even if she could keep the assault up, the reason she only brought out her paper bombs after he'd shown prowess, and the reason she was, even now, still smirking to herself. She was overconfident. She thinks she's so much better than me. I wonder. This'll be a gamble, but if it works. He brought his hands in front of him and used his specialty, even as a devilish grin spread across his face. Transform. Temari was feeling pretty good about her odds of winning as the boy's clone burst into white smoke, having been as easily dealt with as everything else he'd thrown at her. Her teacher had told her that something odd was up with him, and to not underestimate him, just in case, but just like with all of her other opponents, she'd had no trouble in dispatching him. She'd done her best to rein in her overconfidence, preventing it from dictating the state of the match, as it had a tendency to do, but she couldn't help but gloat as she walked over to her opponent's real body, laughing all the while. Well, nice try, I suppose. The shadow clone surprised me, but it wasn't ever going to be enough. She heard movement on her left, and turned with her weapon drawn to meet it, expecting a trick from her opponent, but found only the exam's proctor, standing there with an odd smile that didn't at all match his features. She took a breath, letting the last of her worry flow out of her as she drew her fan closed, holding the large metal instrument towards her opponent's face on the ground. Yield. The boy turned to face her, looking up at her with a small smile. He drew his hands together, forming the sign for the shadow clone, but Temari was faster, easily knocking his hands apart with the end of her fan, and then bashing his face with it, causing the back of his head to collide with the stone floor. It was a bit cruel, but she couldn't mind that. They were going to destroy this entire village, after all. If she couldn't deal with hurting one little boy, she'd never be able to fulfill her duty. Perhaps you didn't hear me. She spoke again, bringing the fan down once again to rest near his face. Yield. The boy below her sighed, but put his hands beside his head. I yield. She sighed in relief, pulling back as she stood fully, and walked back towards the proctor, waiting for him to call the match. As 1 second turned to 2, then 3, she felt a bit of unease work its way into her mind. Excuse me, sir, she tried to be as polite as possible, assuming that this was perhaps a home bias towards Leaf Genin, and that maybe, by endearing herself to this man, he would allow her the victory she'd earned. Naruto Uzumaki has surrendered. Wouldn't you please call the match? Naruto Uzumaki has not surrendered. The man spoke calmly, coughing a second later. Thusly, I cannot call this match over. He hasn't. What? She turned back around, looking back towards where her opponent sat in a small crater, and found him still lying there. He was injured, and probably had a concussion. Standing only a few feet from her was the proctor, walking towards her at a lax speed, hands in his pockets. She turned back around to the proctor, anger working its way into her system. Look over there, don't you see him? She complained, pointing back towards the boy in the floor. He's down, and he surrendered. Miss Tamari, I'm sorry. The man before her gave just the tiniest fraction of a smile, like a small crescent the day after a new moon. But the surrender of a clone does not count as a loss. Her instincts flew as she swung around, drawing her weapon as fast as she could, but the clone in the hole was already dissipated. She backed away, looking around the arena. The hole where I banished that bastard's clone, the place where I destroyed the other clone, the exam's proctor. The exam's proctor. Her eyes widened as she turned back around, where a second proctor stood, smiling lazily, as if this were all just the tiniest bit amusing. She swung her weapon behind her with blinding speed, trying to catch the fake proctor with her weapon, but the man ducked underneath it, sending an uppercut straight to her jaw, which had her reeling as she was knocked backwards. Shit! Shit, 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 shit! He tricked her by pretending to be destroyed before, but really, the white smoke hadn't been that of a shadow clone dissipating, but of a transformation jutsu being used. He transformed into the exam's proctor, walked calmly towards her and into her worst range, and landed a solid hit. I have to summon my... Before she could even think about biting into her finger, she was knocked back, kicked straight in the stomach, and felt her breath leave her. She tried to recover, tried to raise her guard, but the boy was relentless, summoning more copies of himself and overwhelming her, until, with one last attack, he pushed her to the ground, drew a kunai, and held it to her throat. Yield! The fake proctor spoke, eyes shining with mirth that shouldn't have been present on his face. She growled under her breath, tried to think of any way out, but blanked. She sighed a second later, fell back on the stone floor beneath her, and admitted the truth. I lost. Naruto shot up immediately, raising his hands above his head, and shouted in victory. I won! He ran around in circles, hollering and whooping, and generally feeling like he is on top of the world. I won, I won, I won! Someone behind him cleared his throat, and Naruto turned around to see the exam proctor with a quiet smile on his face. We're all very happy for you, Naruto, but if you wouldn't mind... The man actually blushed, though Naruto could clearly tell it was out of embarrassment. Could you release your transformation jutsu? Watching myself do all of this is a bit odd. Naruto looked down at his body to find that he was, in fact, still in his disguise. He smiled and rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Why, yes, sorry. With a puff of white smoke, Naruto was suddenly 2 feet shorter, and more than a little tired. Transforming for a few seconds was rather easy, but keeping the illusion up for minutes at a time could be difficult. It wouldn't have been for anyone else, and he'd heard stories of ninjas staying in disguise for weeks, but they didn't have to deal with a monster's chakra coursing through their veins at all times, constantly interrupting the flow of their own chakra as it did. Having kept up the transformation for a few minutes was a thing to be proud of for Naruto, and he smiled remembering the look on the girl's face as she realized his trick. That'll teach her to get cocky. He chuckled under his breath, starting to walk up the stairs to leave the arena, but was stopped by a hand on his shoulder. Excuse me, but shouldn't you go on ahead to the infirmary? The proctor spoke, putting his hand back into his pocket. Blood loss is not to be underestimated. About that. How do I say, well, the demon in my chest has already healed my wounds, so I'm totally fine. Without actually saying that at all. Don't worry about him, the demon in his chest already healed his wounds, so it's no biggie. Zabuza said as he walked down the steps, taking Naruto by the collar and dragging him up. Thanks for looking out and all. The proctor seemed rightfully stunned, but a second later seemed to come to the conclusion that this was all beyond his pay grade, because he simply sighed, turned around, and began muttering to himself. So that's the Nine-Tails brat, huh? Naruto thought he heard him say. He turned back towards Kakashi's stand-in, with just a bit of indignant annoyance. Shouldn't you be keeping the whole Nine-Tails thing a secret? The demon of the mist looked back down at him with a tiny sneer. Not from Jonin, kid. They already know about your existence already, and especially ones from the Leaf. Zabuza shrugged. No reason to keep it hidden from your allies, right? Naruto grumbled under his breath, but also couldn't really see a reason to refuse, so he stayed quiet for the most part as the man pulled him up the remaining flight of steps, only questioning why he was being dragged in the first place as he got to the top. He was just about to complain about it when Sasuke stepped up next to him, looking equal parts proud and annoyed, which Naruto couldn't help but think was a bit funny. I thought you said you understood. His friend spoke evenly, not seeming terribly upset, but more confused. What are you talking about? Naruto asked, feeling a bit of confusion himself, but realizing a second later what his friend must have meant. Oh, you mean the plan, right? Yeah, thanks for that, you really helped me. But you didn't follow my idea at all. What? Sasuke tilted his head to the side, eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, as if trying to peer into Naruto's soul. I said to use your anger, and instead, you kept a level head, dealt with the situation intelligently, and persevered with a well-thought-out plan. The boy's eyes narrowed even further, looking at him out of slits. Completely unlike you. Naruto couldn't help but blush a bit at the praise. Well, you said to use my anger, and I realized that you were trying to send me a coded message. Naruto nodded proudly, with a please praise me more look on his face. You were trying to tell me to calm down, since she was using my anger, right? Sasuke sighed, massaged his head with his hands, but smiled a second later, laughing quietly all the while. I meant for you to use the Nine-Tails chakra. Sasuke explained, a residual smile still set upon his face. After all, don't you need to be angry to reliably use it? Naruto honestly had no idea if there were any such restrictions on the Nine-Tails chakra, but he could see how the boy might have figured that, given that his only experience with power-ups recently were when Sakura got mad and when he died. It might have also had something to do with how Sasuke got his new 3-Tomo Sharingan, through the rage of seeing his best friend fall before him. So, does he think the only way to gain power is to get angry? That's pretty edgy. I don't know if that's how the Nine-Tails works, to be honest. Oh, sorry, I didn't know. Nah, it's fine, like you said, your words still helped out. Sasuke smirked, leaning against the metal bar in front of him as he gazed out over the arena. I wonder who'll be next. Well, it's random, so it could be any. Excuse me, Naruto? The new voice had Naruto turning to his left, where, just beyond Sasuke, a small, blue-haired girl stood waiting, a tiny vial in her hands as she shook ever so slightly. Oh, Hinata? He wondered what the girl was doing up here, and as he stepped around Sasuke, who walked over to stand with Zabuza, he asked her. Oh, I wanted to give you this. The girl drew herself into an incredibly deep bow, holding out a small container of something towards him. For your wounds. Actually, my wounds are already healed, thanks anyways. Felt like the logical thing to say, but Naruto couldn't help but feel like that would have been a little bit rude. It's a gift. The girl's sensei, who Naruto was fairly sure was named Kurenai, spoke up from behind her, smiling indulgently as she shook her head. You should accept it, even if you have no need for it now. Keep it with you, just in case. He nodded to the woman, more out of respect than anything else, and reached out for the vial. When his hand touched Hinata's as he took it, the girl flinched, and Naruto couldn't help but feel a bit bad about that, like he'd accidentally kicked a puppy. Thanks, Hinata. He tried to give his best smile, the one Sasuke told him once looked like the sun, but he couldn't help but think it came off a bit forced, not quite reaching his eyes. I'll take care of it. Ah! The girl stuttered, putting her hands into the pockets of her jacket, and taking a step back. Don't worry about it, I'd rather you use it. She was playing with the strings on her jacket now, twirling them with her fingers in intricate little patterns that seemed to command Naruto's attention for whatever reason. You don't need to take care of anything that The girl seemed to cut herself off, before, with a pale face, she took another bow, and went back off to join her team. Her sensei sighed as she watched the girl go, before turning to Naruto again with a small, sad smile. Thanks for that, Naruto. That girl, well, she doesn't have a lot of things that she likes doing, or people she likes to talk to. The woman's smile became a bit brighter, but it was like sunlight peeking out from behind storm clouds. But I think you give her. Well, it's not my place to say anything else. The woman stepped back, waving as she walked to stand behind her team. Good luck with the next stage of the exams. He couldn't quite help the feeling that he was missing something as Sasuke stepped back to stand next to him, a quiet sadness playing across his features. Hinata Hyuga. His friend spoke quietly. I hear she was outed from her clan after her little sister defeated her in combat. I didn't know that. The last bit of joy from his victory was snuffed out in the somber mood between the two of them, and as the minutes ticked by, and the arena floor was finally fixed, the room turned once again to see who would be fighting next. When the roulette came to a stop, Naruto gasped quietly, looking back to the girl he'd been speaking to just a moment ago with no small amount of fear. Misumi Tsurugi vs. Hinata Hyuga. For her part, Hinata didn't look nearly as terrified as he'd figured she would. She wasn't composed by any sense of the word, shaking slightly with nerves. She took careful steps towards the stairway, but the way she walked seemed almost fake, a bit too wooden, a bit too calm. Do something. A voice in his mind commanded. Do what? He couldn't help but think. I don't even know what I'm expected to say. But I think you give her. Well, it's not my place to say anything else. He remembered Kurenai-sensei saying, as the woman walked back towards her own team. Give her what? And yet, as the girl began to descend the stairs, he realized he didn't have the time to think this one out. And yet, even still, he called out to her. H. Hinata. The girl turned back to look at him, her face a bit pale, but a blush present upon her cheeks. Why, yes? Out of the corner of his eye, he could see all of the members of Hinata's team, Kiba, Shino, and most of all their sensei, Kurenai, giving him approving nods as he stepped up in front of the girl, preparing to say his piece. Good luck out there, he held his hand out, giving her a thumbs up, and a smile that, this time, managed to reach his eyes. I'll be rooting for you. The girl before him gaped, her mouth hanging open for a few seconds before, with a small squeak, she ran down the steps, taking them two at a time. When she made it to the halfway point, she stopped, and mumbled something that he just barely caught. It was a quiet thank you.